The miscalculation: how Iran was perceived as weak. For much of the past decade, a dominant assumption shaped strategic thinking in Washington and Tel Aviv. Iran, according to this view, was entering a period of sustained decline. Economic sanctions were tightening, domestic protests were becoming more visible, and diplomatic isolation appeared to be limiting its influence. From the outside, these pressures created a powerful narrative: Iran was weakening. The foundation of this belief rested heavily on economic indicators. Over the years, the United States and its partners had constructed one of the most comprehensive sanctions regimes in modern history. Iran's oil exports, once the backbone of its national revenue, were sharply restricted. Its banking sector was cut off from large parts of the global financial network, making international transactions increasingly difficult. Inflation surged, the national currency lost significant value, and economic hardship became visible across Iranian society. To many external observers, these signals appeared straightforward. A country facing persistent economic strain would logically have less capacity to project power abroad. But economic pressure was not the only factor shaping the perception of Iranian weakness. Inside Iran, several waves of protests captured international attention. Demonstrations over rising prices, unemployment, and political grievances were widely reported. Images of crowds in major cities created the impression that the Iranian political system might be entering a phase of internal instability. For policymakers and analysts outside the country, these developments seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. If domestic dissatisfaction continued to grow while economic pressure intensified, the Iranian state might eventually face serious political strain. This combination, sanctions from outside and unrest from within, contributed to a powerful strategic narrative. Iran, many believed, was under pressure on multiple fronts. Within certain policy circles, this perception gradually evolved into something more consequential: strategic confidence. If Iran's economic foundation was weakening and its internal cohesion appeared uncertain, then its ability to escalate conflicts might also be limited. This assumption began to influence the strategic calculus of several governments in the region. Military operations, cyber operations, and covert activities were increasingly justified under the belief that Iran lacked the capacity to respond. Yet the story of strategic power is rarely captured by surface indicators alone. One of the recurring challenges in geopolitical analysis lies in how power is measured. Intelligence communities traditionally rely on quantifiable metrics: gross domestic product, defense spending, industrial capacity, and conventional military strength. These indicators are valuable, but they can also create blind spots when a state deliberately chooses a different strategic model. Iran is a particularly notable example of this problem. Since the 1979 revolution, Iranian strategic thinking has evolved under conditions of isolation and pressure. Instead of attempting to compete directly with major military powers through conventional means, Tehran gradually adopted a different approach, one focused on endurance, adaptability, and asymmetric leverage. Under this model, power does not always appear where observers expect it. A country may face economic constraints, yet still maintain effective strategic tools. Military strength might not be concentrated in large conventional forces, but instead distributed through unconventional capabilities. Influence might not be exercised through formal alliances, but through networks of partnerships and regional relationships. For analysts focused primarily on economic weakness, these dynamics can remain partially hidden. History provides multiple examples where states underestimated adversaries because they relied too heavily on visible indicators. In such cases, economic hardship or political tension did not necessarily translate into strategic paralysis. Iran's own historical experience reinforces this pattern. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the country endured immense economic strain, international isolation, and severe military pressure. Yet despite these constraints, it managed to sustain a prolonged conflict against a heavily armed opponent. The experience left a deep imprint on Iran's strategic culture. Endurance under pressure became a central principle of statecraft. Over the decades that followed, Iranian policymakers repeatedly operated under the assumption that external pressure would be a permanent feature of their geopolitical environment. As a result, Many long-term strategies were designed specifically to function within constrained conditions. Rather than expecting sanctions to disappear, Iran developed methods to survive them. Rather than assuming diplomatic acceptance, it cultivated alternative regional relationships. Rather than competing directly with technologically superior militaries, it invested in tools designed to offset those advantages. This strategic culture, shaped by decades of confrontation, often produces outcomes that are not immediately visible in traditional measurements of national power. The result is a persistent gap between perception and reality. To outside observers, Iran may appear economically constrained and politically pressured. Those indicators are real and cannot be dismissed. But they represent only one dimension of the country's strategic position. The deeper question is whether these pressures have actually reduced Iran's geopolitical capacity, or whether they have simply forced the country to adapt in ways that are less visible but strategically significant. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, this question began to acquire increasing relevance. Events across the Middle East were gradually revealing that the earlier narrative of Iranian weakness might have overlooked important elements of its strategic posture. If the assumption of decline was incomplete, then the implications would extend far beyond a single country. It would mean that the balance of power in the region had been interpreted through an imperfect lens. And in geopolitics, few mistakes are more dangerous than misjudging the true strength of an adversary. The hidden strength? Iran's strategic capabilities. If the perception of Iranian weakness was built primarily on economic indicators and internal political pressures, a closer examination of Iran's strategic capabilities reveals a different dimension of power, one that operates outside traditional measurements. Iran's security doctrine has never been designed around conventional military superiority. Iranian leaders have long understood that competing directly with the United States or Israel through conventional military forces would be extremely difficult. The technological advantages, defense budgets, and global military infrastructure of these countries create a significant imbalance. Instead of attempting to close this gap through traditional military expansion, Iran adopted a strategy based on asymmetric warfare. In this framework, the objective is not to defeat a stronger opponent in direct confrontation. The objective is to create enough strategic risk and cost that adversaries hesitate before escalating conflict. One of the most visible elements of this strategy is Iran's missile program. Over the past 2 decades, Iran has quietly built one of the largest and most diverse missile arsenals in the Middle East. Short-range, medium-range, and increasingly sophisticated precision-guided systems form the backbone of this capability. These systems allow Iran to threaten military bases, energy infrastructure, and strategic targets across a wide geographic area. For Iranian planners, missiles serve 2 critical purposes. First, they act as a deterrent against direct military attacks. Second, they provide a tool for retaliation if deterrence fails. Unlike traditional air forces that rely on expensive aircraft and vulnerable runways, missile systems can be dispersed, concealed, and launched from mobile platforms. This makes them significantly more difficult to neutralize in a single preemptive strike. In recent years, Iran has also invested heavily in unmanned aerial systems. Drone technology has become a central component of modern asymmetric warfare, allowing states to project power at relatively low cost while maintaining operational flexibility. Iranian drones have demonstrated increasing range and precision. These systems can conduct surveillance, strike strategic targets, and support regional allies. In many cases, drones complement missile capabilities by adding another layer to Iran's deterrence architecture. But military hardware alone does not fully explain Iran's strategic posture. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of Iran's geopolitical strategy is its network of regional partnerships and aligned groups. Over decades, Iran has cultivated relationships with organizations and political movements across several parts of the Middle East. These networks extend Iran's strategic reach far beyond its national borders. They allow Tehran to exert influence across multiple theaters without relying solely on its own conventional forces. From a strategic perspective, this structure creates a form of distributed deterrence. Instead of concentrating all military power within its own territory, Iran's influence operates through a broader ecosystem of regional actors. This approach complicates the calculations of adversaries. Any confrontation with Iran carries the possibility that tensions could expand across several interconnected fronts. Geography also plays an important role in Iran's strategic resilience. Iran is one of the largest countries in the Middle East, with a population exceeding 80 million and terrain that includes vast mountain ranges, deserts, and heavily fortified regions. This geography presents significant operational challenges for any external military force attempting to conduct large-scale operations inside the country. Many of Iran's critical military facilities are believed to be located underground or dispersed across multiple locations. These defensive measures are designed to ensure that key capabilities survive even in the event of sustained airstrikes. Strategic depths, the ability to absorb pressure without losing core capabilities, has become a central feature of Iranian defense planning. Another dimension of Iran's resilience lies in its economic adaptation. Although sanctions have undoubtedly imposed significant economic costs, Iran has gradually developed mechanisms to mitigate their impact. Over time, Tehran expanded trade relationships with regional partners and explored alternative financial channels outside traditional Western systems. Domestic production also became a priority in several sectors, particularly those linked to defense and strategic technologies. While these adjustments do not eliminate the economic challenges facing the country, they reduce vulnerability to external pressure. In essence, Iran has attempted to transform sanctions from an existential threat into a long-term condition that can be managed. When these elements are viewed together, missile capabilities, drone technology, regional networks, geographic defenses, and economic adaptation, they form a broader deterrence framework. This framework does not depend on overwhelming conventional strength. Instead, it relies on creating uncertainty and raising the potential cost of military confrontation. For adversaries, this means that even if Iran's economy faces pressure, the strategic risks of escalation remain significant. A conflict with Iran would not be confined to a single battlefield or limited to conventional engagements. It could involve multiple domains, missile exchanges, cyber operations, regional proxy conflicts, disruptions to energy infrastructure, and maritime tensions in critical shipping lanes. In such a scenario, the costs of escalation could extend far beyond the immediate participants. This reality challenges the earlier assumption that economic weakness automatically translates into geopolitical vulnerability. States often possess forms of power that are not easily captured by conventional metrics. In Iran's case, much of this power lies in its ability to operate under pressure while maintaining strategic options. The perception of weakness, therefore, may not reflect the full picture. And as the Middle East continues to experience shifting alliances and evolving security challenges, understanding these hidden dimensions of Iranian capability becomes increasingly important, because, in geopolitics, the most consequential miscalculations often arise not from what is visible, but from what remains underestimated. The strategic consequences rethinking the balance of power. When a state's capabilities are underestimated, the consequences rarely remain theoretical. Misjudging the strength or resilience of an adversary can reshape strategic decisions, influence military planning, and alter regional stability. In the case of Iran, the earlier perception of weakness carried an important implication. If Iran was indeed declining under economic pressure and internal strain, its capacity to impose strategic costs would be limited. Under that assumption, pressure could be increased without triggering serious escalation. But if that assumption is incomplete, then the entire strategic equation begins to look different. Across the Middle East, the balance of power is rarely determined by a single variable. Instead, it emerges from the interaction of military capabilities, geography, political alliances, economic resilience, and technological adaptation. When analysts reassess Iran's position through this broader framework, a more complex picture appears. Iran may face substantial economic challenges. Its political system operates under continuous pressure. Yet at the same time, the country retains several instruments of strategic leverage that complicate calculations. This dual reality produces a form of strategic ambiguity. On one hand, Iran is constrained by sanctions, financial isolation, and diplomatic pressure. On the other hand, it maintains the ability to retaliate across multiple domains, military, regional, and economic. The coexistence of these two conditions makes the Iranian case difficult to analyze through traditional models. For policymakers in Washington and Tel Aviv, This complexity creates a delicate strategic dilemma. If Iran's capabilities are underestimated, aggressive strategies could unintentionally trigger escalation. Military strikes, covert operations, and cyber campaigns might provoke responses that spread across several theaters simultaneously. Iran's deterrent structure is not confined to its own territory. Its influence extends through regional partnerships and strategic relationships that operate across multiple countries. Any confrontation, therefore, carries the possibility of cascading effects throughout the region. This dynamic introduces the risk of miscalculation. History provides many examples where conflicts escalated because one side believed its opponent lacked the ability to respond. Strategic overconfidence can create a situation where limited actions generate wider confrontation. In the Middle East, where several rivalries intersect and security environments remain fragile, the margin for such misjudgments is narrow. Another factor that significantly shapes the strategic landscape is Iran's nuclear program. Although Iran has consistently stated that its nuclear activities are for civilian purposes, the technical progress in uranium enrichment has introduced a new variable. Even without confirmed weaponization, the concept of nuclear latency can influence strategic behavior. For adversaries, nuclear latency introduces uncertainty. It raises questions about how quickly Iran could transition to an operational deterrent. This uncertainty does not necessarily mean that nuclear weapons will be developed. However, the mere possibility affects how states perceive risks and opportunities in their strategic planning. Consequently, the Iranian nuclear issue remains one of the most sensitive elements in Middle Eastern geopolitics. In response to these dynamics, diplomatic engagement has repeatedly emerged as an alternative path to confrontation. Negotiations surrounding nuclear limitations, sanctions relief, and regional security frameworks have periodically created opportunities to reduce tensions. Yet diplomacy in this context is inherently difficult. Mutual distrust between Iran and Western powers runs deep, shaped by decades of confrontation, broken agreements, and conflicting regional interests. Each side often approaches negotiations with the suspicion that the other may use dialogue as a tactical pause rather than a genuine compromise. This environment makes long-term agreements fragile. Nevertheless, diplomacy remains one of the few mechanisms capable of managing strategic competition without spiraling into open conflict. Even limited agreements can establish communication channels, reduce misunderstandings, and create temporary stability. The broader lesson emerging from this geopolitical landscape extends beyond Iran itself. In international politics, states are often judged by visible indicators of economic growth. Military spending, technological development, these measurements are important, but they do not always capture the full complexity of strategic power. Some states develop influence through resilience rather than expansion. Others rely on unconventional tools. External observers may overlook the ways in which pressure and isolation can actually encourage adaptation. Iran's trajectory over the past several decades illustrates this phenomenon. Despite persistent sanctions and attempts to constrain its strategic options, the country has managed to construct a deterrent structure. This structure may not resemble traditional models of great power influence, but its impact is nonetheless significant. For analysts and decision-makers, the key challenge is therefore analytical discipline. Geopolitical realities rarely conform to simple narratives of strength and weakness. States that appear constrained may still possess the ability to impose meaningful costs on their adversaries. Conversely, states that appear powerful may encounter unexpected limitations when confronted with asymmetric strategies. The central argument of this analysis is not that Iran is invulnerable or immune to pressure. Rather, it is that the country occupies a more complex strategic position than the narrative of weakness suggests. Understanding that complexity is essential for any realistic assessment of the Middle East. Because in geopolitics, stability often depends not on who is strongest, but on whether each side correctly understands the capabilities and limits of the other. As this analysis comes to a close, one thing becomes clear. In geopolitics, the greatest strategic mistakes often begin with a simple assumption: that an opponent is weaker than they truly are. Iran's story reminds analysts and decision-makers of an important lesson. Power is not always visible on the surface. Sometimes it lies in resilience, adaptability, and the ability to endure pressure over time. Thank you for staying with this analysis until the end. Your time and attention truly mean a lot to this growing community of geopolitical thinkers and researchers. And if you value calm, serious geopolitical briefings like this, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps this platform continue bringing thoughtful analysis to viewers around the world. Before you leave, do share in the comments which country or city you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how a global audience is following the same geopolitical story. Until the next analysis, stay curious, stay informed, and thank you for watching.